Texas Senator Carol Alvarado begins filibuster against GOP elections bill, adding fuel to Democratic fight to block the legislation. When she took the floor, the legislature was on just the fifth day of a 30-day special session, called as Democrats had left the House without enough members present for the Republican majority in that chamber to pass legislation. That leaves plenty of time for the Senate to pass the legislation despite the temporary delay. It adds rather than removes barriers for Texas seniors, persons with disabilities, African Americans, Asian and Latino voters from the political process, Alvarado said at the onset of her effort. Johnson said the Voting Rights Act struck away the last major shackle of the fierce and ancient bond of slavery. Alvarado filled the time by recounting portions of the history of the fight for voting rights, reading testimony on the bill that her office collected from the public and going over portions of the bill in excruciating detail with assists from Democratic Senate colleagues who took turns asking her lengthy questions, often speaking at a much slower tempo than usual, in what appeared at times to be a largely empty Senate chamber. Austin Democrat Sarah Eckhart pursued one of the longest lines of questioning, reviewing significant portions of the legislation with Alvarado for more than 2 hours. Dan Patrick, who presides over the chamber, appeared to be drifting in and out as the night went on, but made no efforts in the first 6 hours to raise procedural objections that might cut her off. Ahead of her filibuster, Alvarado acknowledged the bill would eventually pass in the Senate but framed her effort under the same use every tool in the toolbox mantra House Democrats have adopted during their quorum break targeting the legislation. "I'm using what I have at my disposal in the Senate," Alvarado told the Texas Tribune. SB 1 is the Senate's revived effort to restrict voting by forbidding local officials from taking various steps to make voting more accessible, and further tightening the vote-by-mail process. SB 1 is nearly identical to legislation the Senate approved in the first special session, and is opposed by Democratic lawmakers, civil rights groups and advocates for people with disabilities who have raised concerns the bill would limit access and suppress marginalized voters. Pushed under Texas Republicans' mantle of election integrity, SB 1 enhances partisan poll watchers' freedoms inside polling locations and sets new rules, and possible criminal penalties, for those who assist voters, including those with disabilities, in casting their ballots. Republicans have pushed forward with those changes even as advocates for people with disabilities have continued to warn that the wording of SB 1 risks disenfranchising the voters who lawmakers claim they want to protect by limiting the assistance voters with disabilities could receive and potentially subjecting those helping them to increased penalties for mistakes. SB 1 adds 1 extra hour of required early voting hours, increasing it from 8 hours to 9 hours per day, and lowers the population threshold for counties required to provide at least 12 hours of voting during the second week of early voting in state elections. But the bill would also outlaw local voting options like the 24-hour voting and drive-through voting efforts championed in Alvarado's home county, Harris County, even though the top elections official for the Texas Secretary of State has told lawmakers he is not aware of evidence of fraud tied to those initiatives. Those prohibitions have piqued particular outrage by Democrats and voting rights advocates because Harris County has indicated the initiatives were particularly successful in reaching voters of color. Ahead of the chamber's preliminary vote on the bill earlier Wednesday, Hughes did accept a series of amendments that addressed at least one line of concerns raised by voting rights advocates. In what appears to be a concession to Democrats who have pushed for its creation, SB 1 includes language to allow for a new correction process for mail-in ballots that would ordinarily be rejected because of a missing signature or an endorsement the local review board determines does not belong to the voter who returned the ballot. The Senate signed off on an amendment to allow voters to address those issues online instead of requiring them to visit their county elections office in person. The chamber also added an amendment to allow the curing process to cover the new ID requirements the bill creates for Texans voting by mail. SB 1 requires those voters to provide their driver's license number or the last 4 digits of their social security number on applications for mail-in ballots and the envelopes used to return their ballots. For their votes to be counted, that information must match the person's voter file. The bill also prohibits local election officials from sending unsolicited applications to request a mail-in ballot, even to voters 65 and older who automatically qualify to vote by mail, or providing applications to local groups helping to get out the vote. The eventual passage of SB 1 in the Senate is expected to be the latest strike in Republicans' struggle to clamp down on the state's voting process, which has now extended into a second round of legislative overtime amid the Democrats' blockade in the House. Disclosure: the Texas Secretary of State has been a financial supporter of the Texas Tribune, a nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization that is funded in part by donations from members, foundations and corporate sponsors. Financial supporters play no role in the Tribune's journalism. At a time when newsroom resources and revenue across the country are declining, the Texas Tribune remains committed to sustaining our mission, creating a more engaged and informed Texas with every story we cover, every event we convene and every newsletter we send.